Stephen down on his knees. The key testimony to James's historicity in Eusebius, a writer in the 4th century, and here we're getting to abstruse things, based on Hegesippus, who was one of the early church fathers closest to the events in question, writing around 150 or 160 CE, pictures James down on his knees in the attack on James. Also, you'll find the same vocabulary used and the same vision. Stephen sees the heavens open in the attack on James in the temple by the final death scene, not the attack by Paul in the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions, but the attack in Eusebius's version of early church history based upon Hegesippus. You know, Eusebius was Constantine's bishop and was instrumental in organizing the early church councils that brought about the Roman form of Christianity we now know as the dominant one. But originally he had been bishop in Caesarea in Palestine. So he was in touch with a lot of old Palestinian sources, particularly this Hegesippus, who never seems to have gone west and who was lost. So a lot of Western theologians and early church historians like Tertullian and Irenaeus don't seem to know Hegesippus. So there's a whole Eastern axis composed of Hegesippus in the 2nd century, Origen in the 3rd century, who, by the way, was considered a heretic by some, and Eusebius, and then Jerome, who comes east, gets in touch with Palestinian sources. So all of these materials I set out for you. Finally, the actual prayer Stephen utters, not only the vision, the fact of his being on his knees, the actual prayer is word for word the speech James utters in the attack on the temple. So these are things you wouldn't ordinarily know if you didn't compare the sources. So you say, oh yeah, sure, the attack on James is overriding Stephen. Ah, perhaps, but maybe it's the other way around, and that's for you, the reader, and the audience to decide. All I can do is give you my opinion. I put the sources out there, which is why we have 1,000 pages. My publishers wanted this book cut down to 350. Actually, we cut out 500 pages dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I felt, since it was so controversial, and since the dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls is so full of pitfalls and differences of opinion, such that now very few have any agreement as to what these scrolls mean at all, that we should save the parallels of James with the teacher of righteousness of the Dead Sea Scrolls for a second volume. Actually, a lot of that is covered in this new book by Eisenman called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, which recapitulates some of my earlier writings previously published by Brill. James the Just and the Habakkuk Pesher and Maccabees Zadokites, Christians and Qumran, which Bajan and Lee mentioned in great detail. So they weren't readily available, and Eisenman brought this book out in November under the title The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. It contains those two books, 5 or 6 other very important essays, previously unpublished essays of mine, and 3 translations of key documents: the Community Rule, the Habakkuk Pesher, and the Damascus document. And the reason I thought it was necessary to translate those 3 documents again was because the presently available translations often miss the key usages because they're not tuned in to these key questions in early Christianity. The key usages, often they're not consistent. They don't call righteousness, righteousness, works, works, last judgment in a consistent way, nor do they often have the militant apocalyptic spirit of these documents. You know, the Community Rule is actually banishing people and cursing them. And you really have to get the militant apocalypticism of these documents, and therefore I felt those are the key ones, and I've published them again in this Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. Let's go back to James. So one of the first episodes then to worry about is the attack on Stephen. And frankly, Stephen is where anti-Semitism moves into the New Testament, because Stephen really does give voice to some extremely hostile, if not inflammatory statements about Jews and the people that are persecuting him. I want to say one of the things that I think happens in the documents that we have, and I'll explain to you why I think that happens, and then you can ask me questions and I'll go further. One of the things which I think happens is that as James and Jamesian Christianity is written out of the documents, Pauline Christianity is written in, and anti-Semitism is also written in. Let me give you an example of where that occurs in my personal view. The characterization of Peter. The introducer already mentioned that I think James is the legitimate, true successor of Jesus. Peter, too, is an important successor. But as you know, if you've read the scripture carefully, Peter is subservient in almost all instances to James, even in the picture of the book of Acts, which is very highly polemicized. Even there, in the final so-called Jerusalem Council scene in chapter 15, how many are familiar with that scene? The rulings. Who gives the final rulings, James or Peter? James. And Peter is there, and Peter must defer to James's rulings. Those rulings are so important. Because another key thing I didn't know before I started writing this book that came to me as I was writing this book, I know a lot of you are just beginning in this field. It sounds like Greek to you. This field is so complicated, and you have to come at it with a fine-tooth comb, which is why so much pseudo-history. People will say, I'm writing pseudo-history. We'll see. And who will be the battleground? You folks are the battleground. You are the judge. Who's writing the pseudo-history? And who is overriding who? My book was reviewed in the New York Times by someone who was formerly associate editor of the Catholic Biblical Quarterly and Jesuit trained. Well, that's fair enough, but honestly, I don't think this is the kind of book that you should give to someone who is constrained to certain beliefs. You have to come on this at this subject with a totally free mind. So, of course, he said that I'm writing the pseudo-history, and I didn't have my facts straight, and slammed me tremendously. But in fact, if you look at that review carefully in the New York Times book review section from April, it's he who doesn't have his facts straight. And, you know, it is really very interesting. He, for instance, mentions one of the characters that I have in this James, the brother of Jesus, in my dedication page. He spent most of his time arguing over my dedication page.